네, 주말 동안에 김이사 좀 김정은 관련된 뉴스가 많이 나왔어요. 김정은하고 러시아, 푸틴.
뭐 이제 푸틴하고 베스트 프렌드죠.
거의 그렇게 됐고 지금 이게 이제 우크라이나 전쟁하고도 연장선에 있는 거잖아요. 이렇게 무기도 팔고, 그러니까 이게 웨폰 딜 거래했다 해가지고 CNN, 뭐 팍스 뉴스에서 아주 계속 보도를 했는데 헤드라인으로 이거 어떻게 생각하세요?
이런 방향으로 계속 밀지 않았어요? 지금 What do you expect? 이렇게
그러니까.
러시아를
예,
한
공지
구석에
몰랐죠.
몰아놓고
예.
하고 그런 식으로 해가지고 계속 돈을 지원을 하면서 거의 3차 대전 가까이 이렇게 가는 조 바이든 이 무책임한 이런 타이틀을 봤어요. Joe Biden is sleepwalking us into World War
I
III.
think that's what's happening right now.
Sleepwalking.
예.
이 인간은 도대체 뭘 하는 건지도 모르겠고 나 너무 지겨워가지고 이제 집에다가 그냥 Let's Go Brandon이라는 걸 붙여놨어요.
그러니까
이제
저도 이제 TV에 바이든 나오면 전 잘 안 보게 돼요.
난 토할 것 같아.
네, 그냥 안 보게 되고 그냥 사실 뭐 이거는 근데 저는 이제 사실 트럼프 인터뷰도 요새 안 봐요. 왜냐하면은
트럼프 얼마 전 뭐 했더라고요.
메간
인터뷰를.
켈리 쇼에
예.
이제 인터뷰 나오고 그다음 미트 더 프레스에도
Meet the
이렇게
Press에
나왔는데
나왔더라고요. 근데 좀 이렇게 Meet the Press 같은 경우는 ABC 프로그램이잖아요.
NBC,
그죠? NBC.
예.
그 NBC에서 좀 이렇게 인터뷰하는 그런 자세를 보니까 CNN 타운홀하고 자세가 굉장히 다르고 또 어떻게 보면 진짜 이렇게 대화를 들어보려고 하는 그런 느낌이 들긴 들었어요.
예. 근데 저는 이제
어떻게 봤는지요?
다 보진 않았어요. 저도
네.
제가 아까 얘기했다시피 요새 트럼프 뭐 유세나 인터뷰 잘 안 보고 저는 요새 왜냐하면은 전 세계 미국의 딥스테이트 상대로 딥스테이트가 있다고는 다들 지금 인정하는 것 같아요. 좌우 진영을 떠나서. 근데 이거를 어떻게 이길 수 있을까 생각을 해보면은 이렇게 전국 정치나 그러니까 national politics, presidential election 이런 데 관심 갖는 것보다 우리의 그런 local issue,
네.
state issue 이런 데에 더 관심을 갖게 되더라고요.
맞죠?
저는
예,
솔직히
그렇죠.
이게 어차피 변하지도 않는 건데
네.
굳이 이렇게 계속 두들겨 봤자 바뀌는 게 없는데 그래서 이런 로컬 이슈 저는 좀 더 관심을 갖게 되더라고요. 김 이사도 좀 지치지 않았습니까?
뭐 그렇다면 일단은 주지사서부터 캘리포니아 우리는 캘리포니아니까
캘리포니아. 예.
주지사 먼저 바꿔야 되는 게 맞는 것 같아요. 주지사가 꺼져야 돼요. 내가 볼 때는.
그러니까
게빈 뉴섬이 꺼져야 돼요.
게빈 뉴섬이 솔직히 이제 너무 자녀들한테 민감한 이슈들을 자꾸 건드니까 이제
그렇죠.
사람들이 거기서 많이 깨어나는 것 같고 사실은 저는 리콜 거의 된다고 봤었어요. 작년이었나요?
됐어야 되는 거였다고
근데
봐요.
갑자기 이제 버락 오바마, 조 바이든 뭐 이 총동원했잖아요.
네.
민주당 진영 기득권 멤버들이 그러면서 이제 리콜이 실패하고 저는 라리 엘더가 들어가는 루트가 보였다고 봐요. 그 당시에는. 근데 이제 기득권의 파워를 느꼈죠. 이거를 막는구나. 왜냐하면 그 전에 아놀드 슈왈제네거가 보궐선거였기 때문에, 그러니까 스페셜 일렉션이었기 때문에 주지사가 될 수 있었던 거거든요. 그래서
네.
그 노선으로 라리 엘더가 가는 것 아닐까 생각을 했는데 기득권 파워가 막강하다는 걸 느꼈습니다.
그런데 확실히 제 주변에 보면은 뭐 이렇게 흑인 유권자서부터 뭐 멕시칸 아메리칸 유권자
네.
대부분 트럼프를 많이 이렇게 지지를 하고 있고 오히려 공화당의 policy가 더 낫다라고 이렇게 바뀌어지는 게 매일매일 느껴지긴 한데
느껴지긴 해.
까봐야죠 이거를.
느껴지긴
까봐야지.
하는데 진짜로 그렇고요. 예. 그리고 그렇게 글쎄 그냥 노조하고 예를 들면 LGBTQ 커뮤니티 그리고 할리우드, 빅테크 이런 곳이 기본적으로 민주당 성향이기 때문에 그리고 이게 그렇대요. 스포츠팀 예를 들면 레이커스 평생 지지했어요. 버스턴 셀틱스를 평생 지지했어요. 그냥 스포츠팀 지지하듯이 그냥 난 무조건 민주당이야 이렇게 생각하는 사람이
그렇죠.
은근히 많은 것
그렇죠.
같아요. 뭐 정책이
그렇죠.
어떻든 나는 그냥 데모크라시아
그러니까
하는 사람이 많은 것
캘리포니아에서
같아요.
70만 명이 이렇게 빠지는
그러니까.
이게 7만 명인가 70만 명인가
예, 70만.
명이
예.
이렇게 빠지는 이 꼴이 됐고 캘리포니아가 뭐 그렇게 세계 경제로서도 그렇게 강하다고 얘기하는데 이런 기업들이 다 빠지고 그리고 또한 이런 사람들이 빠지고 스몰 비즈니스가 빠지고 이렇게 빠지게 되면은 어떻게 될지 답은 다 아실 것 같아요.
예, 근데 다시 이제 김정은 푸틴으로 circle 해가지고
예.
지금 러시아, 중국, 북한이 이렇게 뭉치는
그렇죠.
그런 모습을 보이고 있는데 이것과 관련해서 저희가 전문가 한 명을 모셨죠.
네네 그 Tim Shorrock이라고
예.
네 이분은 그 U.S. Foreign Policy 그리고 U.S. National
제가
Security
잠깐
하고
한국어로
Intelligence
소개를 할까요? 이게 좀 잘 갖고 왔거든요.
그 한국어로 좋죠. East Asian Politics
예.
정치에 대해서 굉장히 잘 East Asia
동아시아. 예. 그러니까 팀 셔락이 1980년부터 5.18 민주화 운동을 취재했던 그런 미국 기자고 그 96년 일간지 Journal of Commerce 거기 이제 한국의 군부가 5.18 민주화 운동을 진압하는 과정에서 지미 카터 대통령 그리고 행정부가 어떤 역할을 했는지를 최초로 보도하는 그런 역할을 했습니다.
예, 저희가 그 팀 슈락을 모시면서 이제 그 인터뷰를 진행을 할 건데
네.
아마 우리가 그 예전에 그 댓글을 봤듯이 좀 보면은 그 5.18 이슈 특히 굉장히 이렇게 나눠져 있는 그런 이슈예요.
네.
그래서 이 팀 슈락 같은 라이터 같은 경우에는 그 자기의 경험담을 이렇게 얘기를 하는
그렇습니다.
부분이 있을 건데
예.
이것에 대해서 뭐 한번 들어보시고 그리고 또 이제 얘기를 해보는 게 좋을 것 같아요.
예, 여러분께서도 그냥 무조건 나는 우파야, 무조건 내가 믿는 게 옳아 이렇게 생각하는 것보다는 좀 이렇게 그 마음을 열고 상대 진영은 어떻게 얘기를 하는지 들어볼 필요가 있는 것 같아요. 그리고 저는 이제
네, 저는 솔직히 이거에 대해서 의견은 저는 그냥 배웠던 그대로예요. 그냥.
예.
뭐 학교 또 회사 뭐 주변에 있는 사람들한테 배웠던 그대로이기 때문에
네.
한번 이렇게 얘기를 들어보고
네.
그리고 또 이제 여러 의견을 들어보는 게 저는 그 좋을 것 같습니다.
예, 그렇습니다. 그리고 이제 팀 셔락이 그런 얘기도 하죠. 뭐 5.18 운동을 일부 우파 진영에서는 이건 북한이 조장한 거다 이렇게 얘기를 하는데 거기에 대해서는 분명하게 이제 음모론, 그럼 완전 말도 안 되는 음모론이라고 그렇게 얘기를 하는 대목이 나오는데 아무튼 여러분 생각은 저기 댓글로 남겨주시기 바라고요. 이분 같은 경우에는 이제 그 부모님이 선교사셨대요.
네.
그리고 이제 부모님과 함께 일본 그리고 한국에서 이렇게 유년기를 보냈다고 합니다. 그래서 한국하고 일본 이슈에 굉장히 이제 애착이 강한데 약간 그런 얘기를 했어요. 좀 안타깝다고 여기에 그렇게 관심을 갖는 한국 동아시아 정치에 대해서 관심을 갖는 그런 저널리스트가 부족해서 아쉽다. 뭐 이런
네.
식으로 얘기를 했습니다.
네, 제가 먼저 경고를 해드릴게요. 우리 우파 진영을 서포트 많이 하시는 우리 시청자 그리고 청취자분들이 좀 안 좋아할 만한 그런 의견이 나올 수가 있습니다.
제가 볼 땐 그래요. 이런 전문가들도 진짜 내부적 예를 들면 대장동 사건 아시잖아요. 그런 거에 대한 생각 왜냐하면은 제가 그 얘기
나는 그
했어요. 한우
미국 고기 말도 안 되는 그 보도가 난 기억이 나요.
그렇죠. 그래서 그 한국 정치가 굉장히 복잡 다단하잖아요. 꼭 이렇게 일본 이슈,
거기까지.
여러 가지가 있기 때문에 제가 말하는 거는 그래서 진보 진영 일부 저널리스트도 그런 내용은 잘 모르시더라고요 보니까. 어쨌든 팀 셔락은 그 전문가, 동아시아 전문가, 미국인 저널리스트의 그 시각으로 어떻게 바라보는지 그게 궁금해서 저희가 초청을 했거든요. 그래서 인터뷰를 했습니다. 저희가 그리고 꼭 이렇게 진보 진영 계신 분만 인터뷰하는 게 아니죠.
네.
그렇죠. 우파 진영들도 이렇게 초청을 해서 인터뷰를 하고 있습니다. 근데
네, 혹시 이렇게
무조건 얘기는 다 들어봐야
프로그램을
돼요.
보면서
네.
I have this kind of information to share. 저는 꼭 이렇게 문화충격에서 이쪽 지역에 있던지 아니면 줌을 통해 가지고 꼭 여기서 얘기하고 싶은 게 있습니다라고 생각이 되시는 분들 언제든지 저의 댓글로 쓰시든지 또는 그 메시지를 주시면은 저희가 이렇게 얘기를 사전 인터뷰를 통해 가지고 이렇게 초대를 하도록 하겠습니다.
네.
그러니까 언제든지 이런 의견을 하고 그리고 함께 하고 싶은 마음이 있으시면은 알려주세요. 자, 우리가 지금 팀 셔락 님하고 그리고 연결을 하겠습니다.
All right, okay. So North Korean leader Kim Jong-un received body armor and drones as parting gifts while wrapping up a 6-day trip to Russia. So they struck a weapons deal thing. What is your thought on that, Tim?
Well, it's. I mean, I'm not surprised at all. The United States has been flying nuclear-capable bombers in South Korean skies for years, and has recently stepped it up and sent nuclear submarines to Busan. So it's not surprising that the DPRK is going to try to get use its alliance with Russia to try to get similar kinds of weapons. I mean, it's an escalation, but it's escalations on both sides, and it's a very dangerous situation, I think.
So Tim, I'm sure you're referring to the joint drills that South Korea and also the U.S. And also even Japan, they actually engage in, and they've been engaging in a lot of these drills. And it's to deter the North Korean government or North Korea from doing their nuclear program and continuing to fire off missiles. But how do you feel about the ROK president right now and his foreign policy towards North Korea? Is there anything that's being done at this point, in your opinion?
Well, he's very hawkish. He has rejected the engagement policies of Moon Jae-in, the previous president. He has, he's made a deal with Japan on forced labor in which Japan pays nothing. Everything South Korea has to pay all the indemnities and reparations for the people who were exploited during World War II as a way to, create this three-way trilateral alliance with the United States and Japan. And that agreement to me is, and I think a lot of Koreans agree with me, is a complete sham. I mean, I don't understand how anyone can call that diplomacy, superb diplomacy as Biden does, when the aggressor country doesn't pay anything in war reparations for that damage that was done to Koreans. So I'm not impressed with Yoon's policy at all. And the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan is known to be one of the most subservient to U.S. interests in the Pacific. And, previously, I think South Korea has had a lot more autonomy from the United States than Japan has. But under Yoon, I don't think it does have that anymore.
So you think President Yoon is too pro-Japan, his policy so far?
Well, he's definitely pro-Japan. He's letting Japan off the hook on this agreement. Mm-hmm. I don't understand how it's a model of diplomacy at all. He just gave in to their demands. They don't want to apologize. They don't want to pay reparations. They don't even want to admit that they did this exploitation. Mm-hmm. And as someone who's been in Korea many times and knows many Koreans and also understands Japan and the LDP that's been in power basically since 1955, I don't see that as a very progressive policy at all. Very helpful to peace. I think the way that they're escalating, they have been having these trilateral military exercises, which of course are seen by North Korea and China as provocative. If this is what the Biden administration thinks is going to bring North Korea to a negotiating table, it's just ridiculous, I think, and it's very wrong-headed of them to think this.
Mm-hmm. Tim, you mentioned Joe Biden, and he's sending money to Ukraine. And he's doing all these types of things. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But what about what Trump did in his presidency? Meet with the North Korean leader. I mean, what do you think? Do you think Trump becoming president would improve situations, or do you think? What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts on that are a little bit complicated because I detest Trump. I think he's a neo-fascist. I think he's a reactionary, and he thinks he's a king. He's trying to destroy American democracy. I think the only positive thing he did in his whole presidency was to meet with Kim Jong-un and as the leader of the United States, meet with the leader of North Korea and try to work out a peace deal. That was a smart thing to do. But Trump is such a narcissist that he made it all about himself. And he didn't really have any interests of the Korean people in mind, or even the American people. It's all about him. And, they almost had a deal in 2019. I think it would have been a pretty good deal to make as an interim step towards peace, which was, Kim Jong-un offered to shut down about 80% of his nuclear facilities in return for, dropping the latest U.S. and UN sanctions that had been imposed, when he started firing ICBMs in 2017. And I think that deal, would have been a very good step, but Trump was, talked out of it by John Bolton, who has zero interest in peace in Korea, would like to destroy North Korea, and has called for the bombing of North Korea in the past. And, it was just a disaster, I think, that it fell apart. And Biden, just said those talks, just gave Kim Jong-un a step on a place on the world stage where he didn't belong, gave him legitimacy. and just scoffed at the idea of direct engagement. They say Biden says he willing to talk with them anytime, any place, but only over denuclearization. And that's not a starting place for negotiation. You don't ask the other side, to surrender first.
Yeah,
If you want to make peace, you have to have something that is of interest to them. And I don't see any sign of that whatsoever from Biden. Trump might try to return to these talks when he comes back, as if he's elected president, which it's very doubtful to me that he will. But I don't think he would be able to do anything. I think it's gone way past that, and I think there has to be a real change in American policy in the area for there to be, even take simple steps toward peace.
But Tim, don't you kind of think that the situation regarding North Korea worsened ever since Biden got into the White House? It was much more peaceful. The missiles were not going back and forth when Trump was in the House.
Well, everything got worse with Biden.
Well,
that's for sure.
up to 2019, February 2019, when the talks collapsed, the Kim Jong-un government had a sort of moratorium on testing long-range ICBMs that could hit the United States, and they still have not held tested another nuclear device. But things were actually a little more peaceful during that time, but up to 2019. But after that, they began testing these different kinds of rockets, and rockets they can place on submarines. But they have weapons. They're testing weapons that can hit the U.S. bases in Japan and South Korea and Guam that are all aimed at them, North Korea. So it's they have deterrence policy just like America has deterrence policy. So to cut through that, what do? You have to take some steps that North Korea might be interested in. And right now, they're not going to denuclearize and get rid of their nuclear weapons because they see that as their protection. And I think there has to be some kind of steps taken. Like it'll have to start with some arms control steps. They have nuclear weapons. How do we control that? How do we make agreements on controlling nuclear weapons? For each side. That's where it's going to have to begin, because they've made it very clear they're not giving them up. And I think if policy based on them giving them up is just not going to go anywhere. And I think that's what we see with Biden right now.
Well, right now, according to the UN agreement, the armistice, they're not even actually supposed to have these. That's kind of the point. That's one of the big points over here. But we mentioned Biden in the beginning, Tim. And Biden's been sending constant flow of money and weapons to Ukraine. He's been helping that out. And throughout the years, I've kind of kept an eye on the North Korean situation. Russia was always like a kind of a part of the six-party talks trying to denuclearize. And right now, at this point, Russia is getting together with North Korea over their own personal arms deal. Are we seeing like sort of a coalition of the communist countries or former communist countries coming together? Are we getting closer to? I keep asking this, like World War III, and I really think that it'll just take a little snap of the fingers or one wrong move, and we're right there.
Well, that's exactly why it's so dangerous, because when you have so many weapons and you have even greater capacity weapons that he may be able to get from Russia, it's a hair trigger kind of situation. There could be one mistake, one miscalculation, and you could have a missile fired and then someone fires one in self-defense, and the original one was. That's how wars start, and it is a very dangerous situation. It's kind of like during the time when there was the six-party talks, quite a while ago, but there was a time when North Korea was under sanctions for testing these ICBMs and for testing a nuclear device. And both Russia and the People's Republic of China went along with some of those sanctions. And of course, that's not going to happen now. They've already made that clear in the UN Security Council. I find it's really just keep escalating on each side. That's getting nowhere. But obviously Russia is seeking certain kinds of weapons for artillery, whatever, for its fight in Ukraine, and then that's what it's looking for with North Korea. But North Korea, the other day, Kim Jong-un, when he was there, he was looking at, their space weapons, looking at their nuclear capable planes and jets and fighter planes and that kind of thing. And I wasn't surprised to see that, because of the fact that the U.S. has been flying nuclear capable aircraft, quite recently in Korean skies and South Korean skies. And I think it's escalating to the point where, I personally wish there could be some third party come in, that to try to settle this.
We know that's not going to happen.
China.
No, I'm talking about some country that doesn't have interests, like not Russia, not China. A country that may be neutral, in this situation. I don't know who's neutral these days, but somebody could. That's how countries have dealt with this kind of tension in the past. I think that something different has to happen.
Actually, I think UN should be stepping in, but we know that UN is pretty much controlled by the United States. I think the United States is. I want to know your thought about the Ukraine-Russia war. Do you blame the United States more regarding this? Because you understand the 2014 Euromaidan revolution that happened in Ukraine. Do you blame the United States more, or do you blame Russia more? We have to do the blame game at some point.
If we're going to blame somebody, I think the U.S. and NATO kept enlarging NATO against Russia's warnings, and they kept doing things that Russia kept saying don't do in Ukraine. They had this, overthrew this government in 2014, and that government is pro-NATO, and they were arming them, and that's continued. I think it's wrong. Russia was wrong to invade. And the kind of bloody war, the destructive war they, fought on against the Ukrainian people is terrible. But, I hate to say but I think that the U.S. and NATO, the other day, the president of NATO made a speech where he basically said this. He said that they had warned the U.S. and NATO not to enlarge it. Russia had warned them, and NATO went ahead and did. And then he said now they've got NATO all over their doorstep in Sweden and so on, which is all true. I think both sides are fighting over Ukraine, and that's dangerous. It's terrible for the people of Ukraine and for the people of Russia who are getting fighting in this war.
Tim, sorry to cut in on you there, but what you're saying right now is being reported by a lot of the conservative media in that sort of fashion, that Russia has sort of a right to be upset about this and fear NATO or not be happy about the NATO situation. But when you see liberal media, they're largely pushing this war. They seem to be all for the Ukraine people. Why do you think liberal media is doing this? Why are they so gung-ho about having this continue?
Well, American liberal media is in the pocket of the military-industrial complex. They take their, they don't have any independent reporting about this war. It used to be that, the Washington Post and the New York Times, used to have really good coverage, in my view, of Korea during the war in Vietnam. They didn't just take the U.S. word for it and just run that. You read the press today, and you listen to watch CNN and these networks, these liberal networks, so called, and they just follow the dictates, and all they have on are people speaking from the U.S. NATO side, and there's very little attempt to even understand the other side, and to me that's really a sad state of affairs.
Well, and Tim, you've been a journalist for a long time too. You're an American writer, also a commentator on U.S. foreign policy with a special, I think, knowledge on East Asian politics. You've witnessed the politics of Korea for a very long time, and you're telling us this basically, right?
Yeah, I'm much more comfortable talking about East Asia because I know much more about it. I can't, give you a litany of everything that's happened in Ukraine, but I mean, war is war, and you see the results of it every day. And I guess it looks to me like Russia thinks their backs are against the wall, and so they're gonna prevent Ukraine from becoming an independent NATO country by any means necessary, and the U.S. is pushing there has to be a victory by Ukraine, and so it's really at loggerheads, and that's some people are really concerned about this escalating in a possible nuclear war or something. I don't think it's going to get to that, but I think it's really dangerous. I mean, I think the situation with Ukraine and Russia and NATO now is sort of analogous to, in some ways, to the Korean War, because I think if the history of the origins of the Korean War, you go back to the early 50s. As there was insurgency war in South Korea before the North Koreans crossed the line. I mean, there was communist-led leftist fighters in South Korea that rebelled against the U.S. military occupation and then their Sigmund Rhee regime. And I think there was a lot of it was pretty clear that to American analysts that some war might possibly break out in the peninsula in 1949 and 1950. And when Kim Il-sung decided, for his reasons, advised by the Soviets and the Chinese, to cross the 38th parallel and quote unquote liberate South Korea, I think that's the U.S. took that as a reason. And MacArthur invaded at Incheon, and then what they did, they made a critical decision, which was to push on north of the 38th parallel and and occupy North Korea and push all the way to the Chinese border. And that's when the Chinese came in, and that's kind of like what NATO has done with Russia. I mean, Russia came in, and so then NATO's really expanded. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, they kind of took advantage of Russia taking this step, and that's a war start, and it's really hard to end a war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Tim, you spent your early life in Japan and also in South Korea, and you were there when the Gwangju Uprising happened in 1980. What are some kind of misconceptions of things about the Gwangju Uprising in 1980, and what do you think people should be more aware of? Because some on the conservative side has some misunderstanding about this too. So go ahead.
Well, people on the conservative side in Korea have totally lied about it. They've said it was just some kind of North Korean, there were North Korean forces there, which is complete, utter, ridiculous claims. Mm-hmm. That the United States intelligence, put to rest years ago. But I mean, first of all, I wasn't there when it happened. I was in Gwangju. I visited Gwangju for the first time in 1981, about 8 or 9 months after the uprising. And the only people I met at that time were American missionaries who had witnessed it. And from their story, I put together enough information to understand that, what we had been told had happened was not what had really happened. But as far as misconceptions go, I would say a couple of things. And these are kind of linked, okay? Misconception number one, and this is kind of promoted by the U.S. government and U.S. diplomats when they talk about it, is that it was, Gwangju was just a Korean-only affair. It was a South Korean, as a State Department official told me when I reported on the documents I obtained about the U.S. Policy there. Koreans shot Koreans and Koreans killed Koreans, and we were not part of that. Well, yes, the U.S. did not order any kind of massacre, and the U.S. was not involved in the initial violence in Gwangju, but they had approved the use of military forces under the U.S. South Korean Joint Command. They had approved that as an alternative, and Chunduan did use troops under U.S. South Korean Command, and of course the command structure when the troops went into Gwangju originally, it was just they were given. No one's really been able to find the orders, which have probably been destroyed. But, that massacre was carried out by Chun's forces. There's no doubt about that. But the second part of there was an uprising. And people fought back with guns, rather crude guns that they, took from police stations and nearby towns. And fought back at the paratroopers that Chunduan had sent in, and then they liberated the city. And from everything I know, from all the people I've hung out with in Guangjoo, that those days when they held the city were wonderful days when everyone came together to support the citizen army that had kicked out the Chunduan paratroopers, and people were joyous and sharing their food and water and acting as one people, one city, and they tried to negotiate with the U.S. Embassy, and the U.S. ambassador refused. But the U.S., helped crush the uprising, and that's what I think is something that's not really well understood. That I've tried to bring out of my own reporting, is that even like in the last big article I wrote about this, which was in 2022 in The Nation. With a Korean colleague of mine from Gwangju, was that just about a day or two after the big massacre in Gwangju, the U.S. Carter administration had meetings at the White House, and they decided that the military option was the only option to take, and then around that time, they asked the South Korean forces to withhold retaking the city until the U.S. could get its own, sort of strategic aircraft and ships in place to monitor the situation or whatever they did. There was the aircraft carrier was deployed, the Coral Sea, and of course, these surveillance planes that constantly fly out of Okinawa over Korean skies. They were all in place. They made sure those were all in place when the South Korean army, moved into Gwangju on May 27, 1980 to retake the city. And so the U.S. was directly involved in that. And then, when they retook the city, in the U.S. said, there was hardly any deaths, and they were, rather peaceful, et cetera, but they rounded up hundreds and hundreds of people, put them in military prisons, and many were tortured and beaten in these military prisons. And, the U.S. was complicit in that. And that's why, once the word got out and especially in 1996, when I got these documents, showing how deeply the U.S. was involved, a lot of South Korean people were very angry about that, and I think that it changed their view of the U.S. because if you read, and talk to people that were there at the time, people thought, we're fighting against this terrible dictator, and the U.S. is going to help us preserve our democracy, and they didn't, and and a lot of people felt betrayed, and and I think that's that last point. The U.S. involvement is one of the least known things about Gwangju. and that I think needs to be understood even better.
So you're saying that it's conspiracy theory, right? North Korea getting involved and creating this uprising. It's completely conspiracy theory, right?
It's a complete lie. It's not. I mean,
it's not even conspiracy theory.
There's no. I mean, the only evidence I've ever seen for it is these right wing, personalities have these like pictures of photographs of some of the fighters in the Citizen Army, and then they look like. Then they have a picture of a North Korean colonel they got from some, website or something, and they look a little bit like each other, so they say they're the same guy, right? And they there's actually they claim that there were 600 North Koreans there, 600 North Korean soldiers there. I mean, the U.S. When I first heard this back in 2015, when I was in Gwangju, the time I went there and they gave me an honorary citizenship for my reporting, that was when these reports were circulating by the right there. And I remember, being asked about this, and I was just flabbergasted, like anyone could even imagine this, because at the, South, Korea, the DMZ, that whole area, the border area between North and South, and all of Korean Peninsula is probably the most surveilled area on Earth. I mean, there's, satellites of, U.S. spy planes all the time flying there. And they also had, they were watching the coastline very closely. I mean, there's never been any report from the United States in any form that there was North Koreans in the only report I've ever seen about North Korean involvement was there was one report of a North Korean spy or something. A North Korean was arrested at Seoul Station at some point during the uprising in Gwangju. And some American generals made a big deal out of that. But, I mean, one guy in Seoul cannot organize a city uprising. And it's just, it's an absurd charge. And the thing is, it diminishes the bravery of these people that fought those paratroopers. I mean, this was no small thing to resist that, I mean, these people they were slaughtering people with bayonets and boots and shooting them, and people fought back. I mean, bus drivers drove their buses into the military lines, and taxi drivers did the same thing. I mean, that's not organized. I mean, it's like they acted like, people do in lots of situations when they're under severe oppression. They fought back. And to think that's a North Korean plot is insulting to those people.
Tim, I see, this is a very, very divisive, I think, there's two divisive opinions between the left and the right, and I think this clashes all the time. And when we covered a 518 or 518 Students Association, we saw a lot of comments that come up there. But from what you've witnessed and from the testimonials that you've heard as a journalist and also as a writer who was covering this,
right?
In your opinion, do you think that it was the Chun government or the administration that maybe had something to hide, where they decided that they had to come up with this kind of propaganda?
Well, I mean, Chun did a military coup. Chun took over. He took over. He did a slow takeover of the Korean military. He shot his way to power in the military. The U.S. swept that under the table, even though it was an incredible violation of the chain of command. I mean, in many situations, a general who did that in a command structure would be court-martialed or even executed. I mean, he actually drove. No Tae-woo was the head of the 9th Division. They rolled down from the DMZ and attacked the Seoul garrison, shot their way to power. They killed a bunch of people, and they arrested the martial law commander and replaced him with Chun Doo-hwan. And then Chun Doo-hwan, that's how he took over the military. And then he appointed himself head of this Korean CIA, which had never happened with a military person. And then he seized power in May 17, 1980. And in the most cruel, bloodiest way possible, by trampling, the rights of these Korean people in Guangzhou when they stood up to martial law. And of course, you wanted to hide those crimes. And a lot of people, in the last time I was there, when I was meeting with the 518 Truth Commission, they're relying on even documents that I obtained through Freedom of Information Act, because they believe that most of the critical documents involving what the actions of the Korean military at the time were just destroyed and obliterated, in the years after. So they can't. There's not even any records to go back to. But he was trying to cover it up, and he never, he went to his deathbed, never apologized, was never and one word of contrition for what had happened, and he knew exactly what happened.
So Tim, my next question would be, who is Tim Shorrock? We know that you're a truth seeker, trying to tell the truth as an independent journalist, but we want to know your background, how you started journalism, how you got interested in it, and I think you consider yourself a humanitarian journalist. So what does that mean, and what do you hope your work achieve? It's a loaded question, but can you answer one by one?
Well, I hope to open people's eyes to the truth of what really happens with, especially American foreign policy. This is my country. I'm a citizen of the United States, and if I feel like we're doing wrong, and we're supporting the wrong people and helping oppress people, then we should know about. Americans should know about that. And so, that's the overall purpose of my journalism. But humanitarian journalism to me is I have reported from, places like Gwangju, where, people were killed, and there was an uprising, and there was a huge, terrible assault on people, a bloody assault on people. And I've reported from disaster zones like, Katrina, New Orleans, and the Gulf Coast after the terrible hurricane there. And, people would come when I was doing that reporting. Distinct times I remember when people said, please help us get our story out. We need you to tell our story. I heard that in Guangzhou. I heard that in Mokpo. And I heard that in New Orleans. And so it's a sort of a, to try to tell the stories of people that are not heard. People that don't have a voice, and trying to get that out, trying to get that information out. But I started as a journalist. Really, if you look at my website, I have this site about the 1960 revolt against Syngman Rhee when I was living there, right?
Yeah, that was huge, right, in your life, seems like.
It made a big, it was the first time I ever saw people stand up, for democracy, right, and kick out a dictator. It happened before my eyes. I was amazed to see it happen, and so anyway, I put a lot of clippings together, and wrote something about it and made a scrapbook out of it, right? And it's on my website now. But you could, that was sort of my first journalism, really. But I really got interested in being a journalist. I was, in high school. I was on my high school newspaper, and I always liked to write. But really, during the movement against the war in Vietnam, people were looking at in America, I was very active in the anti-war movement, and people were looking at, okay, how did we get into this war? And people started looking at, some of the corporations and arms makers that were profiting off of the war in Vietnam. And I got really interested in doing that kind of corporate research and seeing, the economic interests that sometimes play a big role in a war. And that was sort of how I first started, investigating American foreign policy, was by looking in the corporation's role in supporting the war in Vietnam and how they profited from it. And then, I started writing about, I went to South Korea quite a few times in the very early 80s after Gwangju, 1981, 83, 84, 85. And I was reporting from the scene there, and, talking to people that were underground and student activists and trade unionists and so on. And I wrote about that, trying to get their stories out, because there was very little attention paid to that during that time. And, with very few exceptions, the American press, really kind of didn't really take this movement for democracy in South Korea very seriously. In fact, laughed at it in many ways, and just thought it was just a bunch of Koreans complaining when they should be thankful for what America had done for them. And so I was trying to break through media stranglehold on the truth, and trying to I originally started writing for alternative magazines and newspapers and publications on the left, and so and then for many years I worked in the business press. I learned how to report, and I learned how to investigate corporations and in a business sense. And so I just continued, and in around 2001 or so, I got contracted by The Nation magazine, which is one of America's oldest publications. And I started doing a lot of investigative reporting around American foreign policy at the time. This is even before 9/11, but when George Bush came to power in 2001, I was doing a lot of stories. And then when 9/11 happened, I was investigating corporate role in the invasion of Iraq, and how the U.S. was hoping to privatize Iraqi industries with American capital and business. And so I've always been kind of writing about this link between corporations and policy, and that goes for national security too. As you know, I wrote a book called Spies for Hire about the privatization, the kind of shocking degree of privatization of U.S. intelligence agencies, and that kind of information is really hard to dig up. But I like to report in places where military people or people who work for defense contractors and intelligence contractors are speaking in public, and then talk to them and get their story from them. And that's how I wrote that book. So it's just talking to people that are involved and especially making use of the Freedom of Information Act, and however way to get documents that show what was really going on behind the scenes in situations like South Korea in 1979 and 1980.
I think it'll be a very interesting take to have you on another day to talk about the Carlyle Group, as well as all the other things that you've uncovered during your life of journalism and reaching into things. Tim, I know you had a very short amount of time, but you gave us 10 minutes more than you promised.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Where can we see your work? Where can our audience see your work? Can you kind of advertise your website and all that, so that our viewers can go and check it out?
TimShorrock.com. Okay. And that site not only has lots of old articles going way back, but I also have been loading lots of documents onto it. So a lot of my Guangjoo documents, people go there quite a lot to download my documents, Freedom of Information reports that and other documents I got from the U.S. government during that time and since. That's where all my work can be seen, including what I'm doing now. I mean, I've been working on a book about the U.S. involvement in both Japan and Korea since the end of World War II. And actually, one of my original theses of the book, when I started it about a year and a half ago, was that the U.S. was really trying to get a trilateral agreement between South Korea and Japan. And, they just sort of reached that agreement a couple of weeks ago. So I think I've been on the right track there. So I'm just gonna, keep working on that. I'll hopefully find a publisher for it. It's really not easy. A lot of American publishers are not that interested in alternative views about foreign policy, and especially East Asia and Korea. I've always found it difficult to get people interested.
All right, Tim, thank you so much once again. Enjoy your day.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Talk to you again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
이제 팀 쇼락 이제 탐사보도 기자인데 주로 이제 주류 언론에서는 이제 좀 피하는 것 같아요. 이분 예를 들면은 메타, 이비 뭐 이런 분들 메인스트림 미디어 별로 안 좋아하잖아요. 메인스트림 미디어가 가장 싫어하는 저널리스트는 저기 아닐까요? 줄리안 어산지. 저는 줄리안 어산지 존경합니다. 참고로.
저널리스트라기보다도 어떻게 보면 폭로자,
폭로지.
whistleblower.
아니,
예?
그냥 그걸 기사로 쓰는 게 아니라 야 이거 내가 받았으니까 맞아. 그러니까 더 세죠. 파급력이 더 세고 정말 그 세상에서 알지 못하는 진실들 폭로를 많이 했습니다. 예, 줄리안 어산지가. 근데 인디펜던트 저널리스트가 진정한 저널리스트란 말들이 있어요.
그 제가 이렇게 팀 셔락하고 얘기를 해보고 이렇게 하면은 어떻게 보면 제가 이렇게 어디서 들었던 의견과는 또 너무나 다르고 또 어디서 들었던 의견과는 또 너무나 다르고 또 이쪽에서는 이런 팩트가 있다 그러고 저쪽에서는 이런 팩트가 있고 보면 참 이런 거가 본인이 이제 있지 않았었던 그런 뭐 직접 경험하지 못했었으면은 사실 이런 거에 대해서 이거 뭐를 믿어야 될지 지금 이렇게 굉장히 헷갈릴 때가 굉장히 많은 것 같아요.
그런 것 그 저한테 그렇게 물어보시는 분도 계세요. 아니 도대체 언론사 어디가 진실을 말하느냐. 근데 모든 언론사가 이렇게 좀 특히 이제 CNN 뭐 이렇게 메인스트림 미디어, 뉴욕 타임스, 워싱턴 포스트 같은 경우에는 굉장히 이제 에스태블리시먼트 편이라고 봐야 될 것 같아요. 그리고 특히 이제 그 데모크래트
네.
민주당 기본적으로 민주당을 이렇게 지지하는 언론이라고 볼 수가 있겠다. MSNBC 그다음에 C3 Terrestrial 채널까지 CBS, ABC, MBC까지는 다 이제 민주당 지지하는 그런 채널이라고 볼 수 있겠고 이제 우파 진영 기득권 쪽 우파 진영은 이제 팍스 뉴스 그다음에 월스트리트 저널 이 기본적으로 월스트리트 저널은 근데 보도는 스트레이트하게 하고 그 좀 더 진보 성향이래요. 그 보도는 근데 어피니언 피스가 이제 좀 우파 성향이라고 볼 수가 있겠습니다. 우파지가 많지 않아요. 또 그다음에 저기가 있죠. 그 National Review. National Review는 이제 그 전에 러시 림바가 나오기 전에 이제 대표적인 보수 주간지였다고 말할 수가 있겠습니다. 이제 러시 림바가 나오면서 AM 라디오를 장악하면서 이제 우파 진영 목소리가 커졌고 96년도에 팍스 뉴스가 이제 탄생하면서 뭐 대표적인 스타가 뭐 빌 오라일리, 뭐 션 해너리, 그다음에 뭐 저기 마크 레빈, 글렌 백 이런 스타들이 줄줄이 나오면서 우파 진영의 목소리를 이렇게 힘을 실어줬죠. 뭐 티파티 무브먼트에도 팍스 뉴스가 어느 정도 그 기여를 했다고 할 수가 있겠습니다.
뭐 여러분 기대하십시오. 뭐냐면 빌 마르도 이제 우파 진영에 돌아오는 것 같아요.
그러니까 빌 마르가
그 사람의 의견이 지금 우파로 왔으니까
진짜 재밌는 게 금요일 날마다 팍스 뉴스가 톱 뉴스로 빌 마르를 올려.
그럼 내 말이 내가 말했잖아. 근데 한국 그에 있는 그 미디어도 보면은 그 옛날에 내가 그 미국 고기, 미국산 고기
한우.
그때가 기억이 나는데 저는 미국에서
고기.
살아왔었고 그리고 여기서 그때 그 MBC 보도를 보면서 저는 이게 말도 안 된다고 얘기가 들었어요. 왜냐면 거기서 이제 있는 자료 같은 거로 보면은 다 이제 캐나다 그때 뭐 한 17,000마리가 그 광우병이 걸렸던 그 사례는 사실 브리튼인가 그 영국에서 이런 일들이 있었고 또한 캐나다에서 있었던 자료들이 많아가지고 그런 그림을 보여주면서 계속 미국산 고기를 얘기를 하는 거예요. 근데 미국에서는 그때 한 케이스가 그때 한 개가 있었나 말까. 그리고 대부분 미국의 자료는 이제 그 소들이 좀 이렇게 안 좋은 소들이 이렇게 힘이 없어가지고 하는 그런 모습까지 포함을 시켜가지고 그랬던 기억이 나거든요. 그래서 참 그때 느꼈던 게 참 미디어가 이런 거를 조작을 할 수도 있구나 이런 생각이 들 때가 있었거든요.
사실 그 팬데믹 때도 저희가 얘기했지만 그 이탈리아의 환자들을 마치 뉴욕의 환자인 것처럼 이렇게 방송을 하고 그러니까 악마의 편집인 거죠. 그런 모습들 보면
또 하나 악마의 편집이라고 말하자면 닉 샌맨도 있고 그 케노샤에 있었던 그 총 들었던 아이도 있었고
맞네요. 그거는 저기 그 리튼하우스
그러니까요. 아니 애들이 사람들이 쫓아다니면서 총도 들고 쫓아다니고 있었고 그리고 스케이트보드 가지고 머리를 깨부시려고 그런 모습도 나오고 그랬었는데 그런 것들은 안 보이고 또
네.
QAnon 샤먼 같은 경우도
그렇죠.
있고 사실은 이게 좌파든 우파든 보면 이렇게 그 모든 미디어가 약간의 그런 게 있는 것 같아요. 보면 MBC
예.
같은 경우도 정말 너무나 심했어요. 그게
이제
얼마나 큰 파동이 일어났습니까?
가장 웃기는 거는 항상 일방통행이에요. 항상 진보 쪽에 힘을 실어주고 보수 쪽을 비판하는 그런 시츄에이션들
그러니까
아닙니까?
이제 사람들이 이거 더욱 더 이제 그 진보 성향에 있는 뭐 미디어를 안 믿으려고 하는 그런 현상이 생기면서
예.
conspiracy theory도 생기고 propaganda도 생기고 그렇게
그러니까,
되는 거 아니겠습니까?
예, 그러니까 저는 이제 그런 것 같아요. 우파 진영에서 음모론을 믿는 사람들이 좀 있어요. 예를 들면 QAnon 같은 경우도 그렇고 뭐 그런 5.18이 존재하지 않는다. 뭐 예를 들어서 근데 존재는 그 역사에 있거든요. 예, 근데 그렇게 가시는 분들도 있고 진보 진영에서도 음모론 믿는 사람이 굉장히 많아요. 그러니까 예를 들면 트럼프 러시아 콜루전 그거 음모론이잖아요. 음모론은 밝혀졌잖아요.
그렇죠.
예, 그래서 이런 거를 좀 여러분께서 아실 필요가 있고 예를 들면은 그러니까 버락 오바마 같은 경우에도 얼마나 언론이 많이 보여줬습니까? 사실 이 사람의 게이설도 이제 막 나오는 거잖아요. 사실 옛날 아는 사람들 다 그 당시에는 알았죠. 2008년부터. 근데 이제 막 나오는 거 이제 막 많이 나오지 않습니까? 트위터 통해서도 그렇고.
근데 어떻게 보면 우리의 목소리가 그러니까 이제 우파의 목소리가 또 이제 안 들릴 때가 또 많은 많은 부분이 있어요.
예.
그래가지고 제가 다시 한번 그 문화 충격은 항상 그 목소리가 되드리도록 노력을 드리고요.
예, 그러니까,
노력을 하고
예.
그리고 언제든지 이렇게 초대를 할 수가 있으니까 다시 한번 의견을 제시하고 싶으신 분들 언제든지 의견을 제시해 주세요.
예, 그러니까 저희는 좌에서 우까지 다 모든 사람 초청하죠.
예.
예, 그걸 여러분께서 아실 필요가 있다고
예.
봅니다.
그리고 또 저희가 그거에 대해서 argue를 안 한다고. 예. 일단 argue보다 그 얘기를 들어가지고
그렇죠.
깊숙이 들어보는 게 좀
예.
좀 관심이 있거든요.
네.
어떤 사람들 들어봤을 때
예.
아니 이 사람은 어떻게 이런 사상을 가지고 있을까?
그러니까 여러분께서도 궁금하실 것 아니겠습니까? 그러니까 들어봐야 되거든요. 예, 그러면은 왜냐하면 제가 볼 땐 그래요. 진보 진영이든 보수 진영이든 처음부터 나는 나쁜 마음 먹고 나는 나쁜 마음이 있어. 그래서 이 나쁜 마음 어젠다를 퍼뜨릴 거야. 이렇게 출발한 사람은 없거든요. 한 명도.
조지 소로스.
소로스도 자기 생각에는 이게 선행이라고
아니
생각을 하지
이제
않을까요?
소로스를 대변해 주시는 겁니까?
아니 본인은 그 스타 워즈에서 리벤지 오브 더 시스 보셨잖아요. 시스의 복수. 거기서 나오는 게
스타워즈 레퍼런스가 나오네.
거기서 본인 조지 루카스가 그 얘기를 했어요. 시스는 자기네들이 올바른 일을 한다고 생각한다. 엠퍼러하고
그렇죠.
다스 베이더가.
예, 다들 그렇게
예.
생각하죠.
그러니까 제가 볼 때 그런 것 같아요. 모든 게.
그러니까,
김정은은 김정은대로 북한을 위해서 좋은 선행을 하고 있다고 생각하고
I
시진핑은
don't know.
중국을 위해서 선행을 하고 있다고 생각하지 않을까요? 본인들은?
I don't know. 킹 콘스탄틴이 다 자기가 하는 일이 사람을 위해서 했다고 생각을 할까요?
근데 진짜로 사악한 사람들은 있기 마련이죠. 맞아요. 있어요.
근데 무엇보다도 돈, 권력과 힘 이런 것이 사람을 사악하게 그리고 더욱더 사악하게 만드는 것 같습니다.
root of all evil is money. Right?
그렇죠. 여러분 그 순수한 마음 항상 가지고 계시고
네.
저도 순수한 마음으로 문화 충격을 함께 하겠습니다.
네.
그리고 원희사가 얼마나 순수해요. 지금 원희사가 스트레스 너무 받고 있어요. 요즘에 어떻게 할까요? 우리 술 좀 먹으러
나는
갈까?
저희 미국이 돌아가는 거 보면은
내
뉴스를
말이.
보면은 그러니까 김희사 말도 이해가 가고 저는 진짜 그 스트레스 세상이 어떻게 이렇게 갈 수 있습니까 하는 분들의 마음을 정말 10분 100분 이해를 해요.
네,
예.
저는 사실 그냥 포기했습니다. 포기했으니까 3차 대전 뭐 이제 apocalyptic times 이제 올 거라고 기대를 하고
아니 지금 저기 또
예수님 오시면 잘 모시겠습니다.
중동에서 또 평화 체결할 수 있다 뭐 이런 얘기가 또 나오잖아요. 이스라엘이.
다 one world 뭐 어쩌죠
one world government
depopulation
가고 있어요.
다 됐고 여러분 내일 뵙겠습니다.
네.
사랑합니다.
네, 감사합니다.